just terrific start to the day already. And I am reminded of the incredible amount of trust it takes to get this off and going. I am on a small barrier island off the coast of North Carolina. And so I've seen all the people from around the world. I'm really excited to spend a little time this morning with everyone talking about a topic dear to my heart, optimal mentorship. So there I was, having flown for 20 hours from Los Angeles to Australia, Sydney, Australia, trying to order an espresso. The gentleman across the counter from me said in a question, short black? And I said, no, I would like an espresso. And I got the question again, short black. And as an American, I was sort of mildly offended, and I'm trying to work out that maybe Australian English is a little bit different than American English. I had arrived in Australia at the urging of my PhD advisor, who had somehow talked me into applying for National Science Foundation Summer Institute in East Asia and Pacific Islands. So I was in Australia for a couple of months to interview senior scientists and learn more about their experiences being mentored and mentoring others. I'm quite interested in the transmission of optimal mentorship. Pretty soon, I'm thinking, what have I gotten myself into? We've got different language for coffee. How's this going to work related to mentoring? And I find myself knocking on the door of the first senior scientist I am to interview. And as I'm knocking on the door, I realize that on his door is a cover page of The Economist magazine. And on the cover is his photograph. And then I'm reading the cover and realizing he's the feature article in The Economist. Now, if you ask my husband, you will find that I'm an incredibly confident person. In fact, and he means this in a loving way, maybe overconfident at times when I really shouldn't be confident. So understand when I say to you, I was pondering, maybe he doesn't really want to be talking to me. He's on the cover of The Economist, for heaven's sake. And just as I'm getting ready to depart, he opens the door. He invites me in. I was incredibly nervous, and I sit down and get him to sign all the IRB forms giving permission for me to record our interview. And he says, well, now, how's this going to work exactly? Do I just start talking? At which point I realized he perhaps was a bit unfamiliar with social science. So I said, well, of course you can begin talking, but I actually have a set of questions I'd like to go through. But if you want to just start talking, because I'm remembering he's on the cover of The Economist, let the guy talk. I'll ask you the questions if you don't cover them. Well, he agreed to my plan, so I asked the questions, and towards the end of my interviews, I interviewed over 20 senior scientists in Australia. My husband joined me in Australia and chauffeured me to one of my later interviews at the top of a mountain. It was an observatory. I was to interview an astrophysicist. I'm in the middle of that interview, and I didn't ever use the word mentoring. I asked them questions like, who supported you at the undergraduate level, graduate school, and now, and to tell me a little bit about how they support their students. I'm in the midst of this sort of deep conversation, and I look out the window and I see my husband in the middle of a pack of kangaroos. Well, my face must have betrayed my alarm. If you haven't seen a lot of wild kangaroos, well, they can be quite large, and while their little legs in the front are short, they box. And I'm beginning to kind of be concerned about my husband, whereupon this astrophysicist also turns to look and says, I think you need to get him out of there. So what did I learn from interviewing all these scientists? Well, here's some quotes. One of the Australians, he was educated at Oxford University, and said, quote, in graduate school, my advisor provided support, but it was very formal, almost pompous. But he knew the way research should be done, and then he gave room to do research. He recollected that, this is the style I now use. And then he wondered out loud, why can't you, he meant an undergraduate, read a journal article and then write in the same style? He spent more time, he told me, correcting grammar and writing than he would like. Another senior scientist told me that their supervisor was a ball of energy, and that he was that person's first postdoc. He was in England and had just recently come back from the United States, and he had a new position and gave this person a choice to move with him or stay put. So he moved, and the department was revitalized. He says of this person, he was very smart. He wasn't the easiest to work with, but he encouraged me to go to conferences, which was quite expensive to do at the time for international conferences. Another person told me that their advisor was very enthusiastic, but she came up with her idea for research on her own. He asked her if she was sure about it, as her idea was, quote, quite hard. He spent a lot of time teaching her how to write a publication, but as she said, to be honest, he wasn't always available, and I often relied on secondhand advice from others. Another person said that their advisor was not the sort of person who found it easy to talk to students. We're now good pals, this person told me, but at the time it was quite formal, and he was talking about the 1960s, and now it's more informal, but then it was the era of the God professor. He related that another faculty was sort of a benevolent dictator. Not sure exactly what that meant, but that person shaped most of the environment. And then I'm reminded of a chair in psychology I once worked with, and she told me, as she went to school in Canada, that she never saw her dissertation advisor. When she asked about her actual dissertation, he told her to write it and put it in his mailbox. She waited a number of months, whereupon she worked up the courage to go inquire about any feedback, and he said, well, he'd put it in her mailbox. She told me there were a few grammatical corrections, and then she graduated. Now, I've learned that, like Evelyn shared, stories are important. Our oral tradition is important. It's how we learn. But people also want to know some numbers. So let's take a look at some numbers. We're going to play a reverse Jeopardy game for a moment here. Is this optimal? So what do you think the number 50, thinking about graduate education, what does the number 50 refer to? You could just put it in the chat, or somebody can mute, and maybe Andrew or Rachel can tell me what's in the chat. What is 50? Number of peer mentors. Oh, percent graduation is the correct answer. So 50% of doctoral students finish their PhD. How about 7 to 9? What do you think 7 to 9 is? Again, this number refers to doctoral education. 7 to 9. Not credits. Tears to graduation, that's a good one. Yes, average time to graduation. So 7 to 9. And in Canada, that number has almost doubled over the last 20 years. What do you think the number 11 is? Thank you, that's funny. The years in academic penitentiary. What's the number 11? Any guesses for 11? Hours worked per day, no. This one may be a little bit tougher. Years to get a job. Actually, it's not the longest time to complete a PhD, although that's not a bad guess. Well, it looks like the number of times almost quitting. You guys have lots of good ideas. 11 is the median number of years it takes for people in PhD education to graduate. This is just in Canada. Here it is in the United States. So I pulled some recent data even just yesterday for us to take a look at. What this chart is showing, years from graduate school entry to the doctorate. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is most of them are hovering between 6 and 8 years old. Some are closer to 8 and 10, including humanities and the arts and other non-STEM and engineering fields. Education's at the top. They've gotten a little bit better. When I started my dissertation work, it was just 2001, and there was a lot of interest in the United States and Canada about time to degree. There's been a lot of information published about that, and I wondered, had anything changed over this time? And looking at this chart, it suggests the answer is not very much. So the question is optimal versus optimize. Well, I had a conversation with my husband over the weekend. He inquired what the title of my talk was, and I told him he's an economist, also a faculty member. And we then began a spirited conversation over lunch about what optimal means in economics, which I thought raised some interesting questions related to what I wanted to share today. Economists think optimal is optimized, and it's always relative to what? Is it time to degree? Is that what people want to focus on? Is it relative to student resources expended? I think the data I just shared with you suggests it's not optimal to that. What about faculty or institutional resources expended? So certainly from another social science, relative to what is an important question. We all have our particular viewpoints, and we often think relative to our work, our labor. And part of optimal is thinking about relative to other perspectives. I lived in Arizona for many years. I was at the University of Arizona, and in a very small border town, it's a bit of an artsy community, Bisbee, Arizona, there is this amazing gallery, the Salmon Poe Gallery, and I love this image. I actually have some of his work in my office. He has these comical characters. He wrote the book, and in this book, they often share heads, so they all pass their heads back and forth. And if only we could do this with our graduate students. In psychology, when I talk about optimal, we mean flourishing. And we mean everybody flourishing. Certainly there's a balance to that. I could spend all my time on one graduate student and that person may certainly benefit, but what about the others? So there's certainly a balance to be taken there. Part of optimal is being able to take the other perspective. And there's something called theory of mind. We all develop it, more or less. If you're sort of a normal functioning human adult, I'm sure everyone on this conference has it. We develop it about the age of 4 or 5, and it's the ability to take the perspective of someone else. And that is part of my message today when we talk a little bit about optimal. There is an interesting work done by Harriet Zuckerman, and she interviewed all of these scientists about who had Nobel laureates. She talked about, the book she wrote was Scientific Elite. She published it in 1977, and I commend it to you. She set out to study the accumulation of advantage, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Those who already have, get more faster, and stratification of science. She was very interested in the lineages and found that Nobel laureates, after this recognition, often worked quite hard to further the work and careers of their proteges. She started the book by saying, quote, "Next to nothing is known about how university or labs promote intellectual achievement over and above what would have been the case if the individuals are working somewhere else," which is sort of an astonishing statement if you think about it. I'd like to think we've learned a little bit in the sort of 40 or 50 years intervening that, but not perhaps as much as we need to learn. She found that what characterized these evocative environments was intensive interaction, usually with several generations of both distinguished and promising scientists, along with a healthy dose of competition. She found that these ultra elite were unwilling, quote, to devote time to projects they considered trivial. For example, one of the scientists said, and this is a quote, they were talking about their graduate student. "If she wants to ask me about social things, I will get her out of here fast. I'm not interested in social things. You don't think I'm unkind to say that?" he asked Harriet Zuckerman, who said no. And then he continued, "But you asked me about the real things. You know, science is a human thing, much more than people realize. You never get that in books, and what is written is never quite right. You have to hear it from people who were there." Part of what she found is that these scientists were time conscious, and they constantly even evaluated Zuckerman's performance when she was interviewing them. They would comment on how did she find this particular abstract she might ask them about, or they would comment with a question, well, what evidence do you have for that statement? Now, yesterday in the workshop, we had a number of ethical dilemmas we discussed, including How much time and freedom do you give students to pursue what you might believe are trivial projects? So what these scientists are saying would be not much. We also talked yesterday about avoiding judge mentoring. In other words, a lot of evaluative, typically negative comments about our proteges or mentees, or however you wish to refer to them, PhD students, graduate students, medical student doctors, their work. And yet we are asking students to evaluate, to learn to evaluate evidence. So there is a difference between coming across as evaluative of a person versus evaluative of thinking and the work that they're doing. Now, some good quotes from those senior scientists in Australia that I interviewed about optimal mentoring. They said things like the difference in a mentor versus an advisor or supervisor is someone who can help you get somewhere you couldn't get on your own, maybe with finances, lab, conferences. Another senior scientist says, well, it's the sorts of opportunities that mentors can give you. This person related the guy who was here helped provide an opportunity for me to work on what I do now, even though it doesn't generate money, and he is a very powerful man in science, and having his name on a paper is helpful or not in some cases. Another person said during their sabbatical, it was a pivotal time of two influential people. And one was a friend and the other was a mentor who took this person to meetings and introduced him around. Finally, one of the scientists said she had a postdoc in America, in Boston, and she said mentoring there was fantastic. They give you opportunities, they support you, promote you, a lot of positive support. And after 5 years, I had my own team. She observed that in America, conflict is not acceptable on a team and you have to work it out or leave. Her postdoc mentor taught her rigor and how to do good science and really taught how to do the best science on the planet, she felt. Do the best, he always said. But in the end, he also said you have to cut the umbilical cord and fly off on your own. Well, we don't have to look very far to see why we might care about scientific elite. Just look at COVID and all the science that it took for mRNA vaccines. That work had already been going on, and humanity has benefited from that work. Elite science is important. The lineage heads deliberately did not tell stories. They didn't repeat sayings to drive home lessons. They engaged in a lot of informal exchanges that were task-focused, wide-ranging discussions and one-on-one conversations about a student's work. The Council on Graduate Schools in the United States, some 20 years after Zuckerman's work, also focused on PhD attrition and mentorship. They found at the time, this was about 20 years ago, that there was very little work on what made it effective for graduate students. They said some data exists regarding faculty members who produce high numbers of students with doctorates, and those faculty members generally, and this was very task-oriented, schedule regular meetings with each advisee, interact with students in colloquia, spend 14 hours per week interacting with students, so 14 hours a week in their studies and work, and see students in informal as well as formal settings and collaborate on research papers and presentations and co-author papers. A bit more recently, you're all familiar with the idea of internet memes. Here's one from COVID, we pass it around. But memes also mean behavior that is spread by imitation from person to person. Nakamura and some colleagues, they're out of Claremont College in California, wrote a great book called Good Mentoring in 2009. They looked at senior scientists in the biomedical field, and again, somewhat like Zuckerman's approach, looked at their lineages. They found that there were 6 related but distinct components of supportiveness, consistent availability and involvement, a balance between freedom and guidance, an atmosphere and resources fostering supportiveness, frequent and specific positive feedback, and treating graduate students as respected collaborators and individualized interest in the student. In fact, they identified foundations, interactional foundations of what mentors should do. And I've listed them here. I'm not going to cover them in detail other than to say you should see some things that if you looked at mentoring literature or talked some about mentoring or heard some about mentoring, these shouldn't be terribly unfamiliar. When we talk about psychosocial support, we're meaning things about emotional safety, non-judgmental. Doesn't mean you don't evaluate, you do, but again, not the person, it's the ideas. There's responsiveness, so there's making time. This was in the context of medical training, medical school. Again, support, that conveying empathy. And I found in my own work, you don't even actually have to be approachable. You need to be perceived as approachable. So the most approachable person, if they are seen as having their door shut frequently, then they may be perceived by graduate students as not approachable and then won't develop the support and emotional safety and protege-centeredness we know is so important. Again, this idea of respect. What does respect actually mean? As a psychologist, I'm always very interested in what's the actual behavior. Well, treating the person as a future colleague, accepting their ideas and contributions, and again, having time that you meet informally outside of that work or training session in addition to formally. So we know a lot about what evocative environments look like, what these mentoring means, good mentoring looks like when we are looking at excellence. The other thing that Nakamura points out is, well, is good mentoring just the province of stars and paragons? Is this beyond the reach of us mere mortals? And she would assert, and I would agree that it is not, that we should think about good mentoring, and good mentoring is possible by experienced professionals. Honesty, integrity, and fair treatment are an excellent place to start. There's different ways to mentor well. Sometimes for fun, I Google the internet and I find all these traits of excellent mentors. And I find those lists to be both annoying and impossible. No one has all those traits. We are different, we have different styles, and there has to be room in the mentoring universe for people to express those styles. What mentors need to most understand is what they're best equipped to offer, and then students need to understand what is being offered so that there's a clear set of expectations. It might be that a graduate student can get some type of mentoring from their advisor and some other sources of support from someone else. Good mentoring is also about passing on the practice of good work, including the capacity to be a good mentor when that student's turn comes. And much of mentoring is implicit, it's invisible. We don't make it obvious and explicit. So if you're fortunate enough to have had a good mentor, then, and when you were in graduate school, you were likely to emulate that behavior. If you had a terrible mentor, and I've interviewed people who had what I would call tour mentors, they can learn from that. And usually it's, gosh, I really didn't get this, so I make sure to provide it to my own students. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of our mentoring relationships are average, they're sufficient. And part of what I and others are asserting is, let's at least elevate it to good. Let's elevate it to good. Some of the key behaviors that are involved in good mentoring are rapport and collaboration. These two seem to be the most important to get right. And rapport happens at the very beginning of that relationship. I work often with people in STEM fields, and they prepare a lot for the technical work they do, and perhaps not as much on how to build that rapport early, to figure out what their graduate student is about, what's important, what about their working style, what gets them excited, how is their trajectory going to be different, like this bottom photograph shows you, from our work together. And I encourage people to really think about that and have those conversations early in those relationships. How will we both be different 4, 5, 11 years from now because of this work we're going to do together? Collaboration happens after that rapport is built, and it seems to be the behavior that carries the relationship forward. When people get stuck, it's because one of them really isn't all that interested in collaborating, on whatever that project is. So figuring out and what is of interest both to the student and to the faculty mentor is incredibly important. The other piece that really matters a lot is identity. Many of the senior scientists I interviewed attended university at a time when a lot of people looked like them. You can just look at demographics around the world and see that the professoriate is diversifying, maybe not as quickly as some of us would like, but certainly when we look at gender, for example, half of new professors, assistant professor levels, are now women. There's still real disparities when we're looking at associate and certainly full professor. And there's certainly disparities by ethnicity. But when we talk about identity, there's a lot of work to think about how do we contribute to the socialization and integration of students into the academy. As a community member, an effective mentorship plays a critical role in developing a scholarly identity. Mentorship also helps students see themselves as scholars who can contribute to their disciplines. This psychosocial support, friend-like support we talk about when we talk about effective mentorship has been found to influence scholarly identity for graduate students. And mentors need to understand better how these various identities interact with one another and their mentees. Mentors also need to learn to accept more that the identities of their mentees will likely evolve as they progress toward becoming professionals. Mentors in many fields are typically still white or Asian in STEM fields, and research shows that these majority mentors often hold colorblind views of students and wish to dismiss the idea that social identities shape their students' academic experiences. Sometimes we know from research that faculty from well-represented groups espouse this ideology because they're concerned about being misunderstood or offensive to their mentees. They often don't know quite what to say and even have a fear of being perceived as prejudice. Some underrepresented faculty members, especially those at predominantly white institutions, are also disinclined to sometimes directly address social identities and cultural diversity matters because of their own experiences with inequities in institutional roles and research support. But we know based on the evidence that to ignore race, gender, and other important social identities is to deny the formative effect of these identities on students' experiences in their programs and later careers. For example, knowing that I am Southern from the US, first generation, first in my family to go to the university, and female, should tell somebody a lot about me when I started in electrical engineering. A lot of work these days talks about cultural responsiveness. It is impossible for us to be familiar with all the different identities and mix of identities our students might have. When I was in Arizona, for example, I had a student who I would have identified as Hispanic, but she identified as mixed because her parents were from two different countries, Honduras and Nicaragua. She didn't see herself as Hispanic. In the borderland region in Arizona, people don't identify as Chicano, but in California, they do. It's difficult for any one person, unless it's your area of study, to know all of that. But cultural responsive mentorship can validate students' various identities and help them navigate invalidating experiences encountered while simultaneously reinforcing their self-efficacy in the field. The point is to learn to ask, and ask at the beginning, and ask to learn about students that you're working with in terms of what identities are important to them, what is it that they wished you knew about them, and share what you would like them to know about you. By being able to have some reciprocal sharing, it begins to build some trust and rapport, which is what is essential to any work in doctoral education or graduate school education, regardless of your discipline. Another way to think about high quality, and I went into this in more detail yesterday with the workshop, is this idea of tensility, openness, and emotional tone. A lot of this work comes out of positive organizational scholarship done by Jane Dutton and her colleagues at the University of Michigan. When we think about high quality, we don't mean nice, and I hope the quotes that I shared with you earlier illustrate that. Tensility is about the ability to come back together even after difficult interactions. The fact of the matter is, in mentorship relationships, there should be some challenging feedback provided, some difficult questions asked. I'm challenging students to stretch their wings, expand their horizons, attend conferences maybe they wouldn't have attended, write articles, do research. But that ability to come back together after some negative feedback is tensility. Openness refers to connecting people with new ideas and people that they might not have met that are outside of their sort of normal network. It's again opening people to new ideas and new ways of thinking. Emotional tone, thinking back to when Leslie was talking about positive mentoring, I would talk about those as positive emotions. And it's the ability to express both good emotions, celebrate successes, but also to be able to share when things didn't go so well. We know from the literature that mentors are more reluctant to share when things didn't go so well for them, perhaps because they don't want to be perceived as not competent in a particular area. But those failures are invisible to our students who often are struggling with their own perceived failures about writing or how they're doing on their research. So that ability to create an environment that lets people share successes and also, hey, I'm feeling, I'm nervous, I'm worried, I don't think this went very well. To be able to have those kinds of reflections has been shown to predict better outcomes in mentoring relationships. We can't talk about optimal mentoring without also recognizing their areas of dysfunction. We know that the best mentoring is more positive emotion and the absence of negative emotion, which are generated from these sources. These are from the least common, manipulation, to the most common, neglect. I shared yesterday that I have wanted to write a book about tour mentors. I've been collecting tour mentor stories. People don't want their name associated with those, but there are manipulators out there, and they might be faculty members or students. These are people who take credit for other people's ideas or actively steal their research or otherwise actively try to undermine what's going on in a lab or research setting. General dysfunction could characterize a lot of what maybe happened to people this past year. COVID hit. We are social animals, so suddenly being isolated can be very difficult. We know anxiety rates, for example, have increased. Many people had family members with COVID. My niece was one of the first ones in Florida admitted and put on a ventilator in Florida. She's okay now. But at the time, was I really paying as much attention to my mentoring relationships? Perhaps not. So sometimes general dysfunction occurs. Lack of expertise is another area of neglect and problems. So it's when somebody's expecting that you have that area of expertise and you don't. And this could also, I often hear it from faculty members about students. Oh, I thought they would show up knowing how to do this already. In psychology, it's usually around statistics or how to form a hypothesis or organize their research ideas. Mismatch and neglect are the two most common, and mismatch now refers to a mismatch in expectations, communication styles, or values. We know that shared values seem to be what matter when we look at what keeps people together and collaborating on something that matters to them. But sometimes people aren't all that interested, or their styles of communicating and working are so different that it puts them at odds. Neglect is the fifth and the most common that I have to look out for, even in my own practice, and I study this. Neglect refers to answering the phone when someone's there in your office, missing meetings frequently, or often being late to meetings. This comes off as not being interested in the other person. None of us typically are intentional about any of these areas, but my point in sharing them is to raise our awareness about when we behave in these ways or see this in our graduate students so that we can have a conversation to try to recognize and reduce this dysfunction. What I've tried to do is offer some provocative thoughts about what optimal mentorship looks like. I've shared some stories about what it looks like for people who have been mentored and are mentoring others. And we know what evocative environments look like. So what is it that characterizes these spaces where people are incredibly productive, or these mentoring memes? It's easy for us to think about our own personal practice and think, I'm doing a pretty good job. But part of my message today is we can and really must do better. With the chart that I showed of what little movement there's been in the last 20 years, I have some very specific suggestions. One is to look at your data. And if you don't have data, then work with your institution to start gathering that data. What is the attrition rate for graduate students in your department, your college, your institution? Is that widely available to other students? It's easy for us to look at that information and kind of count, oh, this person left because of this reason, or this person left for this reason, and they're all very good reasons. When we look at the pattern, we can see that maybe there's something else at work here in the institutional structures that we need to start to track and be more cognizant of. Why is it that the time to degree would have doubled in 20 years in Canadian universities? And I'm afraid American universities are no different. So having conversations in your department and college about what does our data look like in the areas we care about, and attrition would certainly be one of those in times to degree, would help identify maybe common areas. For example, one institution I worked with found that where they lost students was not in the first year, it was after they finished their coursework. So they were able to take a look at what was happening when they started working on their independent research to provide some structures to better scaffold and support students to get through that difficult transition. This has also been true even for faculty mentoring. So looking at that data will help you identify some patterns of areas for institutional support. Also, if you don't do this already, and you all are sort of the ones that are the believers, you're here today, you're working on improving your skills. So this might be something you also want to share with your colleagues, is to ask your students and listen, and don't defend, just say thank you. For example, at least, I don't know, trying to think how often I do this, probably every month, and definitely at the end of each semester, we have a conversation about what's going well for you, how are you feeling supported, and what do I need to do differently? And then I just stop and listen to them. You can't defend, because the minute you start to defend, they're not going to tell you anymore. So learning to really listen is important, and asking that question also shows interest. Sometimes maybe you can't do anything about whatever the struggle is, but again, part of what we're trying to do is to socialize them as scholars, and understanding their perspectives and what's going on is important. Learn to have some uncomfortable conversations with our colleagues. These can be difficult conversations about, well, what does mentoring look like in our department or college? How can we get better? And that's why data matters, because it helps to sort of say, well, there seems to be some trajectories here, and is this really acceptable? Is this a selection problem? If so, and often I will hear that, well, they're leaving, it's a selection problem, they needed to leave. Well, then we need to do a better job at selection. Or is it a support and mentorship issue? A lot of research by the Council on Graduate Schools and other scholars suggest there's room for more institutional support, both for faculty to support students and for the students. So having those uncomfortable conversations about where can we get better are really important. It might be even that just one department meeting a year is devoted to really looking at this information, having some information from students, and thinking about how support can be improved. We can do better by also inviting leaders to celebrate good mentoring. I've been at many institutions in the United States and abroad, and often hear something like this. Chancellors, provosts, faculty developers, even deans tell me that lots of mentoring is happening and it's good. And then I kind of wander around and talk to graduate students or faculty members and find they have no idea what those people are talking about. And maybe they were assigned to mentor early on and have never seen them since, or students have varied experiences. And so inviting leaders to celebrate good mentoring also lets them be a little bit more in touch with what's going on. And if there's nothing good to celebrate, well, that's another issue that needs to be attending to. So what are these traditions? Where can you build in structures in your institution to recognize when students are moving forward and how to support that and use that as mentoring means for others? I've drawn a lot on the research, and we can share this slide. I think it will be available at any rate on some of the degree completion and work that I've done. And I've tried to offer some provocative comments to help us think a little bit more broadly than our own one-on-one practice about optimal mentoring. Part of my message is that there aren't a particular set of traits. There are some values like the integrity and honesty and ethics that are incredibly important, and students sense that. And that climate is incredibly important, especially if we're trying to work with students from culturally different backgrounds, and figuring out how to make those environments more welcoming and help those students feel that they belong is incredibly important. I have a colleague who writes a lot about how to support women in mentoring, and I think this is true writ large, which is one of the biggest things that we can do is to have unconditional positive regard. It doesn't mean that we're always going to agree or that we're not going to offer negative feedback, but that's done privately with heaps and heaps of, I have confidence that you're able to do this, to learn this, to figure this out, to move forward. We know what the foundations of good mentoring are, and climate matters a lot more than we give it attention for. Now, sometimes faculty see that mentoring is just extra stuff they have to do. Again, I think I am talking to the already converted, but there are personal benefits, and you might need to learn to make the case to your colleagues and perhaps even to your bosses about why more intentional support, scaffolding, and structure needs to exist for good mentoring to happen. It's easier to work with students who feel well supported. They have less difficulty getting through. They will be more on time. And it enhances your reputation as someone who's able to bring along emerging scholars. Organizationally, there's reputational benefits as to why effective, good, optimal mentoring is important, because then people want to come to your institution. It's known as a place where people will flourish. Of course, ethically, I would say there needs to be a better optimization for students and faculty members. Often the priority is given to faculty time, or a faculty member has been here a long time, so we kind of look askance with a difficult relationship. A lot of that needs to stop. And we have to have those kinds of courageous conversations to optimize it a little bit better for students by being more transparent about what's happening at our institutions, making effective have orientations for graduate students. So build in some room and support for what effective mentoring looks like, and also for what dysfunctional mentoring looks like. Students often are novices. They don't know. They don't know if it's normal. For example, when I was at the University of Arizona, we started a new graduate program targeted to bring underrepresented students into psychology. One of my students was accepted into that program. And after a year or so, I learned that these students had been labeled by other students with some negative nicknames. And the students weren't sure. They finally talked to me and said, is this normal? I mean, is this sort of part of the hazing that goes on in graduate school? And it isn't. What I remember about this episode is I talked with the students about how they wished to handle it, and ultimately they confided in me but didn't wish it to be publicly known, but did go and talk to the program director. So suddenly here I am at a department meeting full of psychologists. No names are being shared, but the incident has been verified and more incidents have been found of this poor behavior. And to a person, everyone's going around saying how their graduate student certainly wouldn't have done that. So these things are very hard for us to want to see, that these negative things are happening. So it kind of gets back around to me, and I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure they didn't make it up. I know who it is. I'm not telling because I'm trusting their confidence that they've placed in me. And so how are we going to move forward? Because we often want to look askance or not be aware. So part of my message is to be aware and to have those conversations, which will create important and positive climates for others. I'm going to pause here and open it some for questions. You can put in the chat or unmute yourself. I know we have a big group, but.
What was the outcome?
The outcome was that some faculty were very upset to hear that, because they were amazed that these very uncomplimentary terms had been given to these students. It took probably a month for them to sort of come to terms that it had happened. And so, a lot of the research says believe the unbelievable. So I had to kind of pull some of that out for them. And they ultimately, the students graduated. They felt better because they had come forward and the behavior stopped. It took about a month or so for it to stop. And of course, I prepared my students to learn how to say, that's not acceptable. You need to stop saying that, because that's also part of what was hard. They didn't know what was normal. Someone posted in the chat about quality graduate supervision MOOC that supports faculty and postdocs, so that's a good resource. What are examples of leaders that celebrate good mentoring? Well, I shared this a little bit yesterday in the workshop. It was a group of faculty members who were trying to get more women mentored and got a grant and started a mentoring program. And they were sort of upset because it was very grassroots and there wasn't support from the top. And I worked with them on that project and kept encouraging them to invite the leaders at the top of the university, who never came to anything. But I said, well, invite them anyway, because eventually one day they might show up, and it's also letting them know that this is important. Well, one day they did show up, and were incredibly impressed at how meaningful an experience that mentoring had been. It was just a semester-long mentoring program had been. That they then started supporting it and showed up at the first workshop for every year. So some examples are at those natural times when students might progress, end of the first year, or if there's going to be different in different graduate settings. Med school, actually, they have the white coat ceremony, progression to qualifying exams. Those times to actually have this designated period that's a reception and a place that's a routine that other students are invited to are when it's done really well. Where I started graduate school, one place they actually had champagne bottles all along the top of the shelves in the room that had been used for the celebration for all the doctorates. So again, those are visible symbols. The more visible that you can also make that is important. Good question. Somebody said that I've focused on graduate student mentorship. Yes, I have. And can it be applied to other mentoring situations? Absolutely. I study mentoring writ large. What I would say is the sort of career supports are going to look different. Like if you're talking about faculty members and tenure track versus non-tenure track faculty members. So certainly those kinds of support and that evocative environments, those positive emotion, positive feedback, these are universal lessons. What you're going to collaborate on might look different, for example, but that behavior of collaboration and rapport are really important. This is a great question about a mentor acclimates a protege into a profession, but over 80% of PhD students are not going into academia. And so how do you mentor your PhD students? There's some tensions around that, because we've all sort of been educated that, well, we're supposed to produce, people like us. And yet we know, especially in some fields and some areas of psychology, they go straight into the industry. I think this is where it's important to recognize that a mentoring network is important, that you can't be the only mentor for your graduate student, and educating them about that is also important. And so depending how your area is set up, to either encourage students to connect with alumni who are in work settings, help to develop their own mentoring network is really important, because sometimes faculty members may not always be the best to connect them, to mentor them for work, but they can usually connect them with other students who've gone in that direction. And so really helping students understand what their options are is important. Have I ever seen a train the mentor type of program, and can they be impactful or helpful? This is a great question. Yes, I have seen those, and there's a lot of work in the United States, especially out of Biomedical Sciences, the National Research Mentoring Network. They actually have a lot of online resources and do a train the trainer program to train faculty how to be better mentors. And some of the work on cultural responsiveness is part of their work. Is it helpful? So I think it's very difficult for people to change their behaviors, even with a 6-hour session that they've been doing for 20 years. That's why I think environment is very important. People who want to change and who are likely to go to those kinds of training are probably more interested and, frankly, maybe the least in need of going to such kinds of activities. So, are they helpful? Yes. Can you learn some frameworks? Yes. Sending someone who is maybe struggling on mentoring, if they're not all that interested in developing those skills, is probably not going to be impactful. How mentorship can be optimized to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is a great question. And it can be challenging. So I live kind of on what I would say maybe there's a couple of camps. There's the people who get diversity, equity, and inclusion and understand how accepting differences and how alienating it can be for some students from certain backgrounds and some disciplines. So they get it. Some of those people look like me, some don't. Then there's the people who kind of have this vague awareness. They've been made to go to some training workshop, but it's really sort of not their thing. And then there's the people who don't really say anything. So they're the ones who are quiet in our department meetings, but are like, I just got to sit through this, and they ignore it. And I think that's where having some of those difficult conversations with colleagues is so very important, because we need to start having conversations about, we're really trying to make the, it depends on the group. So when I'm working with STEM people, I usually make a workforce case and I start pulling data. Like, really, do you mean to exclude this many people from these fields that we say that we have these needs in? They're here. Why aren't we training them? I once had a computer scientist, a chair of the department, ask me, why can't we get any women in our graduate program? And I'm like, well, you're the chair of the department. You have an undergraduate program. You can actually fix this problem for yourself, but it's going to take more than what you're doing right now. There are people across many institutions who are being incredibly successful at doing this. And I think learning to network with those folks and using those as examples. Kay Vaughn, who is a physicist at Vanderbilt University, is one great example. I have a colleague in computer science, Juan, at University of Florida. There are examples. And that's what I think, showing people that this can work is incredibly important. One of the people I was with on the National Academies of Science was medical school. So we had an extra M in STEM when we looked at underrepresentation and mentorship. And he said one of the most interesting things to me, which I have just also found to be true, which is when you have someone at the top who's committed to that and asking those questions and being more inclusive, the diversity numbers improve. And he's done it. I mean, he's been to places and changed those numbers. I've had that experience myself. I ran a scholarship program for many years. And when I actually started going to schools where those students were, guess what? Suddenly we had more students from culturally diverse backgrounds. So I think that intention and leadership from the top really matters. It look like in practice? So what it looks like in practice is that there is an event and they show up, that they give some funding for the pizza, the cupcakes, whatever, and it's not coming out of a departmental budget. What else it means is if there is a annual report or newsletter, that there is a feature in that talks about examples of good mentoring, that there are awards for faculty that are selected by students of who's a good mentor, and that they're presented at public events with donors, and a big brouhaha is made about it, and that the leader shows up. So that there actually have to be visible things they're doing and funding that they're providing. Differences at looking at mentoring for career and professional development versus leadership development. That's a interesting question, in that leadership development, I've done a lot of leadership development work with mentoring, and I would even say much of some leadership program development programs are really mentoring programs. Leadership development, mentoring is about socializing people into a profession and learning how to maybe coach and mentor others. Leadership development, now it's not about you at all. It's always about the other person and having some increased awareness about yourself. So how you can motivate others and not be reactive is important. And mentoring can be helpful in providing role models for that, especially for underrepresented folks who might look around and go, there's not too many people that look like me, because we have formal programs when people won't normally connect. Now, graduate school is sort of a semi-formal program. It's sort of built in, right? That the advisor sort of assumed maybe some mentoring is going on. We're not too sure, but we at least hope some good supervising is going on. I talked about looking at the data for graduate students. You have ideas about some other aspects of data to consider when mentoring teaching assistants or undergrads. Are there data a mentor could collect by themselves? Yes, on those. So when we're thinking about mentoring relationships, what's important to think about is how do you know it's successful? So for graduate education, well, one measure of success is they get a degree. That if you bring in 10 people, they all move through. So you might want to think about that for other settings. How would you know a TA is successful? Well, you might measure that by limited number of people complaining about their grading, and that how the TA is self-rating how their competence about how they're doing that. And you can see there's some data that you could collect. I mean, we all look at teaching evaluations, for example, and I at least have varied feelings about what those really tell you, but you can look at comments and there's room to address some of those with people and just reflect, what do you think happened here? And a failure to do that is a missed opportunity. You can also ask people to collect information. And that's what I mean by saying there's techniques you can use. There's a plus delta. What do you want more of next time I meet with you? If you're working with a TA, and what needs to be different? What other support would be helpful? So just learning as part of your practice to ask those kinds of questions and help those students learn to ask those questions too. Is there a network of mentoring researchers and practitioners that can share what's working well? Okay, so I know Maureen, good question. I know you. So, it's interesting with the National Academy's report that came out in 2019, we have an online portal and we were working to develop that. A lot of the mentoring researchers go to the Mentoring Institute in New Mexico. So I find colleagues there and they tend to come from around the world. The other place is the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. They focus more on coaching, but there are a group of researchers who talk about mentoring. And then there's other areas that focus on youth mentoring, so not really in higher ed. So I wouldn't say and then there's some through like AERA, which is, I would say, focused on more doctoral programs. So some professional organizations have listservs, but I think most of the scholars are somehow networked through the Mentoring Institute is where I've met a lot of them. Be keen to hear about how we support coach, mentor, or academic colleagues, not in relation to leadership, but raising awareness of optimal approaches. Everybody's going to have different, our colleagues are all different. And I think this is where having some informal conversations and maybe reflecting or asking for advice about your own practice starts to open up that question. I know I've certainly had times when I felt that some improvements could be made, but I first sort of ask, hey, here's what I'm doing. What does everybody think about that? Is that the most effective way? Or there's some other ways to share? So you can kind of go in sideways to talk about it and also learn yourself about some things that can be done better. Most of us don't really like it when somebody comes to us and say, I don't really like what you're doing, or somebody complained to me, or any of that. So really trying to work with maybe a department chair if you're not the chair, to have a space for just having some of those conversations is a good way to do that. And then share things that you learn at conferences like this. If that's not your practice, I often ask faculty to come back. What's one thing that you learned that we could do differently? So again, just sort of building that learning community. I know University of Georgia, I have a colleague there, he started with alumni, but it's kind of building and one of the top mentoring scholars is at the University of Georgia, Lillian Eby. And so he's kind of built this very interesting institutional group that they meet occasionally and talk about how can they improve mentoring at the university. And it starts, again, they have leadership support. So they're putting things out. So people just sort of start learning, okay, well, here's a resource I could use. Here's some learning communities around mentoring. Oh, Gerald, thank you for that question. Can I distinguish between mentorship, coaching, and supervision? Well, I go to conferences where all we do for 3 days is talk about that very question. So I'm going to give you my answer, which is just my answer. I think a lot of what I see, I would characterize as coaching or supervision and not mentoring, and people call it mentoring. I think it really, so I would call supervision as you're the gatekeeper. You have to actually assure that somebody has passed some level of competence or something to move on to that next level. Coaching, some people say that it's for pay. I don't think it's always for pay, on the executive level, but it tends to be very short term and focused on a specific skill. And certainly coaching is in that mentoring universe. Mentoring is typically there's a more emotional connection. You have to build rapport in coaching and mentoring, but mentoring is typically longer lasting and focused also on personal growth and development, not just, that career development. I mean, part of career development is, what is going to be your work-life balance, for example. But what I think most matters are the behaviors. And if you can have a shared understanding about what these behaviors are in your institution or with your mentees, that's really what matters. And so getting some clarity about what does it mean in your context to provide career support is really important. And often that's how I've had conversations in departments I've been. Well, what career support are we providing? What does that really mean? Oh, maybe we do need to do more work to sponsor our students to go to conferences, or maybe we do need to do more to help them get some more visibility for their work. And then that psychosocial support, do they feel supported? Is there this sense of psychological safety? Now, what I'm going to say about that is I am the least touchy-feely psychologist you'll ever meet, I promise. And I'm even from the South where we're supposed to be super nice. So I don't mean be nice. I think some faculty hear this as I've got to be in this long, involved, tear-filled conversation as a counselor, and that is not at all what I'm talking about. You can still provide confidence to people, show that you believe that they are capable of that work, and providing safety for them to tell you, I really don't know how to do this, or I'm confused, because we underestimate how worried our graduate students are to actually talk to us. I've actually given talks to graduate students where they tell me, I'm kind of afraid, I'm nervous to go talk to my graduate advisor about this question that I have. And so I think we have to do some work early on and ask a lot to make that free. Supporting graduate students, what might that look like in practice? Some folks who have very different and privileged identities from their students may experience trepidation. Yes, and in the United States, especially right now, everybody is really very concerned about being misperceived. And so much so that I think it gets in the problem, frankly, in the way of having those sort of conversations. So I think just asking people what's important to you, what's important about who you are that you hope that I need to know, people will tend to share that with you. So that if they have an identity that they think is really important, and then we need to share a little bit about that for ourselves. The folks at Cymer who do some of this culturally responsive mentoring actually make a culture box. And so there are some techniques you can do. You can just sort of ask people to show up with your culture box. What is that? Well, you pick 4 things that sort of represent who you are and what's important to you. And one, it gets the person thinking, what is important in this context that I want sort of my colleagues and people to know? And it lets us also share. So it kind of creates that feeling that you can begin to understand those differences. You guys have had some great questions. We have time for a couple of more. And I just also want to add that it's been a privilege to prepare for this conference. So of course, in my mind, I had imagined I would fly into Vancouver and take a train across the Rocky Mountains and be in Calgary. But I appreciate that people are from all over the world to be able to really spend some time the next couple of days to think intentionally about mentoring. And what I hope is that you take it back. I mean, you need to take it back to your departments and really share ideas with them and just think, because there can be a lot, especially if this is new for you. Pick one thing to do and have a conversation about starting for fall. Like, what's one thing that we could do differently, and engage your students in that as well, because sometimes there are obligations for mentees or proteges or whatever word you wish to use, and they need to be aware of that as well. I mean, I often ask students, what do they think mentoring is? Sometimes they tell me, well, it's a little like therapy, and they're not so sure they want to go to that. So I mean, I'm not sure I would either. So having some shared understanding about what that's going to look like is really important. I hear a lot of faculty kind of, I don't want to say complaining, but sort of complaining to me lately about they just seem very needy and they're anxious. And yes, COVID has made things very difficult. And it should show us how important those personal relationships are, and learning to be able to go. I mean, I had a student, she's telling me how anxious she was. I said, yeah, me too. We are in it together. I don't need to solve her anxiety problem. She just needed me to hear it. So I think we all kind of need to learn that a little bit better. What are some of the questions I ask at the very beginning? I always ask what's their, in a formal, with graduate students or undergrads in my lab, what's their must-haves, can't stand. I give it to them before they show up. We all put it in our Google form. We work out of a Google place, so I really encourage people to write it down, or we will write it on a whiteboard. And so we all see what everybody's are, and we can discuss up front if there's going to be some mismatches. Like sometimes students say, I really can't stand it when somebody's late. And somebody else says, well, I kind of tend to work late. I must have pressure to get something done. So we can just sort of sort all that out. The other thing I ask them is, what is it you would like me to know about you? What would really help you for me to know about you? And then we might talk a bit about communication preferences. And I share my must-have, can't stands as well. I know, I'm sorry I didn't get that Rocky Mountain experience. Yes, as an early career faculty member, how do I suggest balancing time for good mentoring? There is a terrific book. I think Boyce wrote it. If somebody remembers the name of it, you can put it in the chat. It's Boice, and he wrote some great advice for early career faculty members, which is moderation. The sum of his book is moderation. Because I find that new faculty especially, they either focus too much on teaching or too much on research, and then it creates problems in the other areas. I found in some work I did with some mentoring of faculty that it was the research faculty, a science faculty, who really needed help on teaching, because they didn't have as much experience doing that as graduate students. And so they had students lined up outside their office complaining. So we had somebody come in from the teaching and learning area to talk with them about how to make their syllabus a little bit better. We taught them about some ombudsman referrals that they can do. That's it, Boyce. Thank you, Norman, for putting that in there. I absolutely recommend that, because sometimes it just helps you learn to moderate so that you have a little bit of time for good mentoring to learn and build your practice in that way. Just do a little bit and you will, I promise, and he does a great job of making the case, that you will become more productive and successful by following that. Yes, you need to, yes, at least skim it. You know, when I read it my first year, I'm glad someone had recommended it. It really was like I could manage a chapter like, every once in a while. But the main message is moderation. So just when I think of it, and I coach new faculty now, is think of your work as boxes. And sometimes one box gets too full. You need to stop putting stuff in that box and go work on the other one. And so sort of having that visual image seems to help some folks. Well, this has been a terrific session. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Natasha. On a new faculty mentoring program, anything I would advise related to that? Yes, talk to your new faculty about what's really going to be important for them to learn. I find that a lot of time people build these beautiful programs and then they're very upset that the new faculty don't show up. Sometimes it's because they don't perceive that it's meeting the actual needs that they have. Sometimes it's because that was scheduled at a time that they really just couldn't attend. So asking at least a subset of them about their goals and what do they really need to work on, and building it around that would be my number one piece of advice. That's where I see people struggle. Thank you all. You've been incredibly wonderful. I'm going to imagine that you've all been incredibly attentive. It appears that you have, because you've written really great questions. And I hope to get you thinking a little bit about what optimal, what flourishing can look like, and how to help your students feel good and be excited, and for you to feel good in working with them.